Tonight, over the cliff with a possible parachute. Congress is close to a new deal on taxes but won't meet the midnight deadline. Nancy Cordes and Major Garrett on what happens next. Doctors are monitoring Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who's in the hospital with a blood clot. Reports from Margaret Brennan and Dr. John LaPook. Mark Strassman on a new technology that could stop deadly drunk driving accidents.
If the optical signature registers above .08,
then the vehicle will prevent you from moving.
And with elephants under siege by poachers, M. Sanjan meets a woman who's become a foster mother, raising baby elephants until they can care for themselves.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Good evening. Scott is off. I'm Rebecca Jarvis. In a few hours, the U.S. will go over the fiscal cliff, which could trigger across-the-board tax increases and billions in spending cuts. However, there is hope for a soft landing. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell and President Obama said today a deal was close. But late in the day, House leaders announced they will not vote on a deal tonight. They're waiting for the Senate. So what happens now? We have two reports, beginning with Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill. Nancy, good evening.
Good evening to you, Rebecca. It looks like the deadline pressure finally prompted a meeting of the minds today, and negotiators agreed to a plan that extends the Bush-era tax cuts for 99% of Americans. But they are hung up on one key spending issue, and so it looks like we will go over the fiscal cliff, at least temporarily.
We're very, very close to an agreement.
Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell said his round-the-clock negotiations with Vice President Biden had paid off.
I can report that we've reached an agreement on all of the tax issues.
First and foremost, the Bush-era tax cuts. The two sides agreed to extend them permanently for all household income under $400,000 a year for individuals, $450,000 a year for families. Negotiators also agreed to prevent the alternative minimum tax on the wealthy from hitting millions of middle-class families every year by permanently adjusting it to inflation. And they agreed to hike the estate tax rate from 35% to 40%. But the first $5 million worth of inheritance would be exempt from taxation permanently. The breakthrough prompted relief for many, including Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman.
I hope the negotiations going on now end with an agreement, and I hope that we will pass it with a bipartisan majority, strong bipartisan majority in the Senate and the House.
But others, chiefly Republicans, were angry that the deal did not include a serious package of spending cuts and might actually add to the deficit. Tennessee Senator Bob Corker.
Everybody on this body knows we've done nothing by the time this agreement takes place to reduce a penny of debt in this country. People know that, and that's a shame.
Tonight, the two sides are still haggling over the $110 billion worth of spending cuts, across-the-board cuts that are set to go into effect tomorrow. They're trying to figure out a way to push those cuts off for at least a couple of months. And because of that, Rebecca, the Senate still hasn't voted, and the House can't vote until the Senate does. So we're still in limbo.
Nancy Cordes, thank you. President Obama gave a briefing on the budget talks before an audience that included former campaign volunteers and supporters. Major Garrett is at the White House tonight. Major, good evening.
Good evening, Rebecca. The president won higher income taxes on the wealthy, but he had to give up a few things to achieve that. Gone, for example, is that $250,000 income threshold that was part of the president's successful re-election campaign. And that's a level that only yesterday top White House officials insisted would not budge. Now it's moved all the way up to $450,000 per household. And though taxes will go up on estates and family farms, the president gave in to Republican demands to minimize the scope of that particular tax increase. Now, all along, both sides said they wanted to keep taxes more or less where they are for most taxpayers, and that's been achieved. But Republicans in the Senate and the House now, for the first time and under the president's steady pressure, are saying they are looking at and are likely to vote for higher income taxes.
For now, our most immediate priority is to stop taxes going up for middle-class families starting tomorrow. I think that is a modest goal that we can accomplish. Democrats and Republicans in Congress have to get this done, but they're not there yet. They are close, but they're not there yet. And one thing we can count on with respect to this Congress is that if there's even 1 second left before you have to do what you're supposed to do, they will use that last second.
The president appears willing and Congress appears prepared to go along with an idea of using time it doesn't really have. But after securing an extension of jobless benefits and tax credits for low-income and poor working families, the president thinks Congress, and more importantly the country, can live with 1 day of cliff diving, but not many more.
Major Garrett, thank you. All of this uncertainty is not sitting well with business owners. It's tough to run a company when you have no idea what's going to happen in Washington. Lee Cowan has that part of the story.
Joanne Vinute is running the numbers. Her payroll is due this week, although she at least now has a hint of what taxes to withhold from her dozen employees. That's only half her worry. The unresolved spending cuts are the other.
It's very uncertain and very unnerving and causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of lack of sleep.
She's the president of Golden State Magnetic and Penetrant, a $2 million a year Los Angeles company that inspects, cleans, and paints high-tech aircraft and aerospace parts. Everything from fighter jets to Mars rovers. Any cuts in defense spending could mean cuts in her business too. And the waiting has her on a fiscal cliff of her own.
What does it do if there's another, month, 2 months, 3 months of this?
It could potentially impact the entire year. It doesn't allow you to make any plans or focus on what your future expansion or growth or anything is.
It could shoot a hole in your whole year?
It could shoot the hole in the whole year.
California has the most workers associated with the defense industry. In 2010, the numbers topped out at more than 160,000 employees. So the wrangling in Washington has a huge impact here.
There seems an element of this that just is...
Unfair?
Is that what you think?
Incredibly unfair.
Because?
Because they have a responsibility and they're not taking care of it.
Now, Vinute's company did have to lay off some workers during the recession, but she said things were starting to get better. In fact, December was a very good month. But Rebecca, all this uncertainty, she says, puts her right back to square one, a problem that she says was completely avoidable from the start.
Lee Cowan, thank you. We're learning more about what caused Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to be admitted to a hospital. Doctors say Mrs. Clinton is being treated for a blood clot in her head. Margaret Brennan is at New York Presbyterian Hospital. And good evening, Margaret.
Good evening to you, Rebecca. And Secretary Clinton and her top aides are inside this hospital. We now know she is being treated for a blood clot inside her head, according to a statement just released by her doctors. Quote, "This is a clot in the vein that is situated in the space between the brain and the skull behind the right ear. It did not result in a stroke or neurological damage." This comes after Clinton was hospitalized on Sunday. This was former President Bill Clinton leaving the hospital this afternoon, where his wife will remain for at least another day. The 65-year-old was last seen in public on December 7th in Northern Ireland, where she spoke about life after her retirement from the State Department.
I look forward to coming back and having some time just to relax and spend a few hours talking with friends and thinking about things besides public life.
Clinton developed a stomach virus while on that trip to Europe and had to cancel a subsequent visit to Morocco. A few days later, back in the U.S., she fainted and fell. Her aides say it was the result of dehydration. On December 15th, the State Department announced that Clinton had sustained a concussion in that fall, and doctors recommended, quote, that the secretary continue to rest and avoid any strenuous activity, and strongly advised her to cancel all work events for the coming week. Clinton canceled a December 20th appearance before a congressional committee to testify about the attack on the U.S. mission in Benghazi. She also missed the December 21st nomination of Senator John Kerry to succeed her. On December 27th, the State Department announced that Clinton would return to work in the new year. It was 3 days later when her spokesperson said she had been hospitalized. Secretary Clinton had a blood clot once before in 1998 as First Lady. She said she developed one in her leg from her nonstop flying around the country. As Secretary of State, that nonstop travel continued. She visited 112 countries and flew nearly 1 million miles. In initial statements, Clinton's spokesperson said she would be hospitalized for 48 hours. Doctors now say they need to see how she responds to medication.
Margaret Brennan, thank you. Dr. John LaPook is our chief medical correspondent. Good evening, John. Good evening. So what do you think has happened to Secretary Clinton?
Rebecca, that blood clot that Margaret described is behind the right ear, and it's in the vein that helps drain blood from the brain all the way down. And what happened is really anybody's guess, but trying to put it together, we know that 2 to 3 weeks ago, she fainted and hit her head. Now, at that time, she could have had trauma. She could have ripped that vein and had a little bleeding, a little clot formation. On top of that, we were told she had a stomach virus, and we know that dehydration increases the odds of having a clot. On top of that, there's this history of a blood clot in her leg, and it is possible that she has an underlying tendency towards increased clotting. That's something down the road where doctors are going to have to look into that.
So how serious does it sound, and what's the prognosis?
The prognosis seems excellent, and the reason is this was found incidentally. She didn't have any symptoms, she didn't have a stroke, she didn't have a seizure. It was just found on an incidental exam. Now, she's going to need, say, 3 to 6 months of anticoagulation. They're going to have to look at her very closely because in the months following head trauma, if you're thinning somebody's blood, there is a risk of causing bleeding. So they're going to follow her very closely, and the prognosis should be excellent.
Dr. John LaPook, thank you. Indians protest for women's rights after a rape victim's violent death. Was the driver going too fast before a deadly bus crash in Oregon? And why this was a tough day to be an NFL coach when the CBS Evening News continues. There were demonstrations throughout India today. Marchers demanded justice for a young woman who died after being viciously raped and tortured on a bus. Here's Elizabeth Palmer.
Protests replaced New Year's celebrations in many places in India today as men and women of all ages demanded changes to the way authorities treat rape and women.
We've gathered here for justice. We just want justice.
The anger first erupted last week, sparked by the case of a 23-year-old physiotherapy student gang raped and beaten by 6 men out joyriding on a New Delhi bus, which is now a crime scene. She died on Saturday, still not publicly named because the stigma of rape is so great. Victims say they're often ignored and humiliated, so it takes an exceptionally brave woman to speak up. Shavna is one of them. After she says she was gang raped in her village near New Delhi, her father committed suicide, believing the family honor was ruined. Now, with police protection, Shavna's decided to press charges. I want them all punished, she says, so my father didn't die in vain. Protests across India show a new generation is challenging deep-rooted sexism, but it will be a long fight. Female babies are still routinely aborted by couples who prefer sons, which has upset India's gender balance. For every 100 men, there are now only 94 women, a number that's still dropping, while rape itself is on the rise. Official figures show a 25% increase in 6 years. Whatever the reasons, Indians are furious. The government, clearly rattled by the outcry, has announced that the 6 men accused in the bus rape case will face murder charges and the death penalty. Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News, London.
A passenger who survived a deadly bus crash in Oregon on Sunday says the driver was going too fast. The bus carrying 46 people slammed through a guardrail and tumbled down a steep embankment. 9 people were killed. New technology could stop drunk drivers before they start the car. We'll see it when we come back. Police are telling partygoers this New Year's Eve to drive sober or get pulled over. Last year, nearly 10,000 people died in the U.S. in drunk driving accidents. Mark Strassman reports new technology could prevent drunk drivers from ever starting their engines.
On October 29, 2010, Matt and Meredith Eastridge were pregnant with their first child, a son. The same night, David Huffman spent the last 2 hours of his life getting drunk. He put away the equivalent of 15 drinks, each one recorded on a security camera. The 25-year-old stumbled out of this Charlotte bar, and 3 minutes later,
I remember saying, "Look at that car," and that was the last thing I remember.
You were hit head on?
Yes, sir.
Both the Eastridges were critically injured when Huffman, with a blood alcohol content 3 times the legal limit and driving 100 miles per hour, hurtled into their SUV. Meredith, 6 months pregnant, lost their baby.
And I think about him every day. I think about, how old he would be and what he would be doing, and
The family you would have had.
right.
There were multiple times in that night that this tragedy could have been prevented.
So we want to take this device and implement it in the car.
Bud Zauk is leading a research team creating technology that could prevent 10,000 drunk driving deaths a year. Unlike this existing breathalyzer test for convicted drunk drivers, these 2 new sensors would test anyone behind the wheel.
The idea is to develop a sensor that can potentially be implemented in the vehicle to prevent anybody that's above the legal limit, above the 0.08 legal limit, from moving the vehicle and driving.
The touch-based sensor embedded in the start-stop button shines an infrared light into the driver's finger and in a half second measures the alcohol content in the tissue. The second type of technology is a breath-based sensor mounted near the steering wheel. It would measure molecules in a driver's breath. How far away is this technology from being ready?
At this stage, I would say we're probably looking 8 to 10 years away, is when you'd start seeing it inside vehicles.
The $10 million funding for Zauk's project is split between 16 car makers and the federal government. But it's opposed by the American Beverage Institute, which represents 8,000 chain restaurants in the U.S. The group made the following statement. Drunk driving fatalities are at historically low levels. We shouldn't try to solve what's left of the drunk driving problem by targeting all Americans with alcohol sensing technology. The Eastridges now have a daughter, Sloan. They hope this technology will be standard in new cars by the time she is old enough to drive. Mark Strassman, CBS News, Charlotte.
One day after the NFL's regular season ended, 7 teams fired their head coaches. Among the newly unemployed are Super Bowl veterans Andy Reid of the Philadelphia Eagles, Ken Wisenhunt of the Arizona Cardinals, and Lovie Smith of the Chicago Bears, plus Buffalo's Chan Gailey, Cleveland's Pat Shurmur, Kansas City's Romeo Crennel, and San Diego's Norv Turner. There is a place of hope for some of nature's most majestic creatures. We'll take you there next. We reported earlier this month about efforts to prevent the slaughter of African elephants. It is estimated that 25,000 are killed every year by poachers who make a fortune selling their ivory tusks. Left behind are hundreds of orphan elephants. Our contributing science correspondent M. Sanjan of the Nature Conservancy found a woman who has devoted her entire life to helping them at an elephant sanctuary in Kenya.
These orphaned elephants are getting a second chance at life, thanks to their foster mother, Dame Daphne Sheldrick.
We try to replicate what that baby elephant would have in the wild, the most important thing being a family.
Sheldrick has lived among elephants nearly 60 years and started the orphanage in the 1970s when killing elephants for their tusks became an international crisis. Over the years, she's discovered elephants share many traits with humans. A long lifespan, mourning of their dead, and strong family bonds. That's led to new techniques for raising elephants in captivity.
So we have a team of keepers that represent the elephant family that they've lost. And here in the nursery, the keepers or attendants are with the little orphans 24 hours a day, because a baby elephant in a natural situation would never ever be left on its own, and all the family care for that baby.
Today, elephants are under attack again by criminal gangs of poachers.
Can you get better soon?
For Sheldrick, it cuts deeply.
I've raised over 150 infants through the nursery here. We've lost our own orphans to poaching. One named Silingay just the other day. And we raised that elephant from 1 week old. It's like losing a family member.
This is Sheldrick's latest adoptee, 1-year-old Kwanzaa. Her mother and 2 sisters were gunned down near a national park, and Sheldrick's staff was called in to help. The baby was in severe shock and would not feed. Kwanzaa was stabilized by veterinarians, then airlifted back to the orphanage. Sheldrick says it's difficult to get traumatized elephants to accept food from humans. So it was a big moment when Kwanzaa took milk from a bottle for the first time. The human touch is crucial, but Sheldrick told us Kwanzaa's fellow orphans are just as important.
She will be able to take her cue from them, and they will be comforting her.
Kwanzaa won't be released back into the wild for 10 years. But if that happens, she would be Sheldrick graduate number 198. That's a record made possible by her caretakers, human and otherwise. M. Sanjan, CBS News, Nairobi.
And that is the CBS Evening News. For Scott Pelley, I'm Rebecca Jarvis. And for all of us at CBS News, Happy New Year. Good night.